Okay, everybody, welcome back to episode 4 of the Firemind Full Circle podcast. Today we're here with Dan White, obviously, myself, Ben Wheeler, but also we're lucky to have a guest here today, Phil Le-Brun. Hi, Phil. Phil's Director of Enterprise Strategy at AWS. We're also, we have a slight change of scenery from our Maidstone offices today. We're very excited to be hosting the podcast from the AWS Executive Briefing Centre at the London Holborn offices. Very nice to be here. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you very much. So, Dan, what sort of things would you like to cover off today with Phil? We've got a guest here who's got a huge presence in AWS.
Yeah.
A lot of experiences. Should we kind of start off with a bit of an intro, Phil, from who you are and what you do at AWS?
Sure. I'm part of a team called Enterprise Strategy. So we're all former CIOs, CTOs, CFOs, that type of profile from large public sector and commercial organizations. We were AWS customers in our previous lives, and we've led transformations. So we have this great job where we meet about 1,600 customers a year, normally at the board and C-suite level. And our role is really to help them make their own mistakes. And by that, I mean helping them understand technology and data and what's possible and how to organize and accelerate their learning curve by sharing what's worked and what hasn't worked in our backgrounds, in Amazon and with other customers. And prior to this, I spent a long time at McDonald's Corporation in various roles.
Nice.
Fantastic, and it's particularly exciting for me, Phil. I've seen quite a few of your talks. Always really enjoy them, the presentations that you do, and I guess in terms of topics, I wonder what the most common topic you talk about is right now.
Guess.
Anyone want to have a guess?
I'm going to guess it begins with a G. I think it's probably generative something. Generative AI.
It seems to be rather popular, although it does lead into a bunch of other topics. When you start talking about generative AI, it's what problem are you trying to solve? Where's your data? How do you organize for innovation? So it's been a real interesting conversation starter as much as just about generative AI itself.
Yeah. And from our point of view, it's probably quite transformed our business over the last 8 months, I would say, becoming a Bedrock partner in June. We've had exposure to over 50 projects now. So we've got lots of great detail about what's blocking customers from progressing or what's the most common use case. And so it'd be really nice today to sort of share our experiences and hear yours as well from both sides of the partner and the customer experience. And understand how we're going to progress this in 2024. I don't know if there's anything else you'd add to that, Ben?
No, that's perfect. I think it'd be great if we could kind of start, Phil. Obviously, we've done a couple of episodes of the podcast already, and we've talked about some of the use cases, and we can dive into a bit more of that as we chat. But what are you seeing customers doing with generative AI at the minute?
These are rough numbers, but probably 90-95% are to do with efficiencies internally. So how do I find information quicker? How do I give a more friction-free response to a customer who's calling into a call center? How do I develop faster, easier, better? So all of those things which are accelerating how people do their jobs internally. What we're seeing a bit of, but not as much, is disruptive ideas. So how do I actually rethink my business? There was that report out, I think it was McKinsey a year or so ago, that said about 75% of the benefit of generative AI is going to come from 4 areas. Sales and marketing, customer operations, things like call centers, software engineering, and R&D. And we're starting to see everyone play in those spaces and figure out what's possible, what isn't possible. What I hope to see, though, is organizations drive efficiencies which free people up to then develop the skills necessary to rethink how they do their business. So start to connect that sort of disruption and efficiency together.
Yeah. And we see that a lot, right, Ben? We see this inverting the triangle, as AWS term it, taking away those high volume, low value tasks and flipping it on its head so that the people in the business can do more of the high value, low volume tasks. Do you see any blockers in terms of the perception of Gen AI and fear, for example, of people's employment being impacted? Do you see that at all?
I think it's fairly common, isn't it? Any new technology comes along and the immediate reaction, whether it's the PC or the internet or the printing press in the 1400s, immediately people think, what does it mean to me? Which is absolutely understandable, a very human reaction. So we did one of the largest surveys across Europe recently, 30,000 businesses and citizens, and asked them about what they saw the opportunity to be. Now, the upside is about 600 billion euro opportunity in Europe, about 109 billion pounds in the UK through to 2030. But if you look at what the blockers were,
Mm-hmm.
what I was quite surprised about is, I think if you listen to a lot of the media, obviously there's that lead in about what does it mean to jobs and the such like. What we actually heard from people was a bit different though, which is they're quite excited, but what they want are the skills to be able to use the technology.
Yeah.
No one wants to come in to work and just do a job. They want to be able to really add value. So, and that was independent of age group too, whether you're baby boomers or Gen X. We saw this reaction, which was just give me the skills. And that's probably the biggest blocker we're hearing from businesses and individuals is, do I have the right skills to be successful?
Yeah.
And then things like regulatory uncertainty too. It's less about regulation itself. It's about what will happen, what will I be prevented from doing in the future. And obviously governments are working through that at the moment.
Yeah. And, in terms of what we see, often, I think in the early days of some of the conversations, maybe back in July, as we were developing with Bedrock, we would have some pushback sometimes, but it seemed to evolve very quickly to the point that it was more about augmenting the human. So we work with different parts of the business. We work with the procurement teams, with the HR teams, contracts teams, doing those everyday mundane tasks and showing them how they can augment what they're doing day to day. So we haven't really seen, I would say, any resistance at all, or any fear. Not the fear that you see in the media, but obviously the media always tends to do that approach. But it's been very positive.
You always have the jokes, don't you? People joke about, oh, is it Judgment Day? And people have this visual of what AI is. But I think that is just tongue-in-cheek with most customers, and they do want to progress. But one of the things, I think now we don't really see the technology. The question is the technology going to actually add value? Like large language models will add value in some shape or form. But often it's how you actually get the data there or other elements, Phil. So do you want to talk a little bit about what's the importance of data and what customers really need to be doing with the data to be able to get the most out of it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of aspects. Firstly, generative AI has been a conversation starter at the board. But when you dig into what the problems are they're trying to solve, sometimes they are purely data problems or ML or AI. Are we calling ML now classic ML or old ML or vanilla ML?
Yeah.
But it's when you actually fall in love with the problem, not the solution, then you start to come back to data's at the heart of all of this. There is so much untapped potential in that data businesses aren't using today.
Yeah.
So arguably, this generative AI has given data a seat at the boardroom table in terms of now being a conversation starter. How are you using your data? Specifically to generative AI, I think originally there was a lot of talk about we need our data so we can build our own large language model. That seems to have died away. Obviously, there's companies out there like Bloomberg who've built Bloomberg GPT, or if you're Anthropic building Claude, those companies are in a very different space to most organizations we work with. But if you're a traditional commercial public sector organization, they need their data for things like RAG, for instance. So if we sort of work down the pyramid, prompt engineering gets you so far. And there's still a lot of training to be done about how to write good prompts. Next step down is things like retrieval augmented generation. How do you do that? Well, you need access to your own data. How do you bring that together? And then I'm not seeing a lot of customers do this at the moment, but when you get into the space of fine tuning, again, you need data. So is that old thing? I've heard some great things recently about data's a new oil. Was the start, which isn't great because you consume oil once and do some environmental damage. Then data's new milk. If you don't use it immediately, it's going to go off. And data's new wine, which is it gets better with age. But end of the day, it's about how do you bring this data together, because there is an innate amount of value just in having that data. And we know one of the biggest barriers to using data to drive business value is data literacy. And that applies to generative AI too. How do you actually understand how to use this technology to ultimately drive value in the front line of your business?
And that's really interesting, because I've done some analysis, Ben. I love stats, and I get deep into my stats. But we've had 23 projects completed now. And a third of those projects' data has been it's generated a new data opportunity for us to do a data modernization project with that customer. And actually, it's been the biggest reason for project delays as well. that the quality of the data, hasn't been sufficient when you get deeper into a use case. So when you're doing an initial proof of concept, it's fine. You're just showing some basic value. But as you're progressing it across that business, then for the first time, it feels like to me, it's brought data to the top of the table, because it's always been one of those things where a customer might say, yeah, we know we need to sort our data out, but the timelines have been a bit slow. But now the Gen AI hook seems to be pushing customers to say, right,
100%.
we really need a data strategy now.
Yeah.
That's definitely been the point.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Phil, going back to a previous point you made, it might not be generative AI. Generative AI is a conversation starter. It might just be a QuickSight dashboard. Pulling some analytics out of some data, with a Gen AI element to QuickSight, but, to do some prompt over the top of QuickSight, but you might not need a full-blown Bedrock API-based solution. It could be just a dashboard.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not as if we all just own a car necessarily. Some of us have bicycles too, because you want to do something different. And it's the same with data. Some of these problems can be solved very easily, but we've trained leaders to do descriptive analytics. How many Big Macs did I sell last Wednesday? But we haven't trained them on predictive and prescriptive. So I think it's a great opportunity at a senior level of organizations to train people on how to use this data properly in the first place. And chief data officers know this. The chief data officers we've talked to, the vast majority of them say that getting the data right, number one, is critical for generative AI, and number two, is critical for the business in general. But a small portion of organizations are still investing there. We are, just like you, we are seeing that go up over time. But we did a study of, I think it was just over 300 CDOs last year. And what I found fascinating too is this isn't just the technology, it's also the culture. Pretty much all of those CDOs said the same thing, which is changing the culture in the organization to use data is critical. And almost none of them had that as part of their job description. So to me, this is about how do you rewire your organization and the technology to be able to use that data and generative AI. But how do you do it in a way where you're constantly delivering value rather than a 3-year data modernization project and then you start to see the value?
Yeah, and I like what one of the things Ahmed, or one of our managing directors, says is about democratizing data and access for all. I really love that phrase. There's something that's in my mind. I just want to, going slightly off tangent, not completely, but Phil, in one of your talks, you talked about blockchain. Who talks about blockchain now? Do you have any concerns that Gen AI will follow a similar path with a big hype cycle and then suddenly everyone forgets about it, or?
I'm less concerned. There's this phenomenon called Amara's law. So we overestimate technology in the short term and then underestimate it in the long term.
Right.
So, you see this in things like hype cycles and the such like, and I'm sure you've seen that with generative AI. I think the difference with blockchain is blockchain has some very, very specific use cases in terms of immutable data. So think of a supply chain. So when I talk to supply chain companies, a lot of those organizations are genuinely using blockchain. But if I ask an audience of 300 mixed executives, how many have revolutionized their business with blockchain like we were told it was going to do? You normally get one hand go up, perhaps.
Yeah.
Generative AI, I think, is very different because it has so many different use cases. And what's fascinating from a historical point of view is it's one of the first technologies that affects white-collar workers first. So if you think about things like the steam engine or many innovations over the years, it's often been about those folks in factories or the such like or service industries. This should touch every one of our jobs. The data we see is, whether it's been sanctioned or not, over a third of employees are already using generative AI to make their job easier to do, to be more successful in their job. So I do think this is different.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that based on what we've seen as well. And actually, just moving on to another point is, I think we were discussing before the podcast that at the moment, the conversion rate for proof of concepts into production is pretty low. I've heard figures of around 10%. What do you think are the biggest blockers from your perspective? What have you seen as the biggest blockers? I mean, I've got some stats from our side, but I'd love to hear your perspective from the exec level.
We had the opportunity to work with 100 customers recently through workshops, and what came out of that was roughly 5% of those customers were moving quite aggressively into production with at least one use case. About 90% were in proof of concept, and about 5% weren't doing much. But then you think of this from a timescale point of view. This has been in the public eye for 18 months now, maybe 2 years. There's obviously a ramp-up time in enterprises. So I think it's still very early days. Well, most of those use cases too, if you look at them, were about internal efficiencies. So in financial services, for instance, it was how do I bring data together? How do I bring information together for a broker in a more seamless way so they can be more efficient? For developers, it was things like Amazon Q Developer. How do I develop faster? So a lot of these were quite safe internal plays. I think what's getting the customers excited now is how do I build stuff and test it quickly to get into production, which are going to affect my end customers. But there's a lot to do. I mean, it's if you start to stack up everything, are you in the cloud? Have you got your data sorted out? Have you put your two pizza team together or the equivalent? You start to layer all this stuff together. There is a lot of complexity organizations have to get through. Plus, a lot of organizations are structured for risk management and control. So you start to put governance layers and the such like, which is where we try and encourage customers. Look, experiment quickly. It's one of the best risk mitigations is to figure out what really works or what doesn't work in practice, not through steering committees.
Yeah.
So do you think having a lowish conversion rate at this point in the life cycle of generative AI is not necessarily a bad thing because of the experimentation, and then we've done the POC, everyone's happy with that, makes sense, now let's figure out how we actually productionize that properly?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly natural. I think there is a challenge, which is how do you go from a proof of concept to production? There's obviously a set of challenges just in doing that and a set of uncertainties. Yeah. Plus the environment's moving so quickly. Every other week there's a new large language model coming out.
Yeah.
And I do hear from the old customer, we're going to wait until the environment's settled down. It's just like, good luck with that. So, the more progressive customers, I think, accept the environment's going to continue to change. How do I quickly start to capitalize on what's available today, knowing I'm going to have to improve it in the future? Just like any good agile organization, it's just don't let perfection stand in the way of progress.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We think about well architected across any workload anyway. We still have to think about that with generative AI workloads, but I think we're just at the pace of, AWS is notorious for its pace of innovation and the number of new services or improvements to services it has every year. And I think generative AI is just even faster accelerated than that. And Dan alluded to those proof of concepts that we did. And while we were doing those, Anthropic released Claude 4, it was in Bedrock, and all of a sudden the data scientists in our team were going, we're getting much better results now. So we're starting to think about how we actually do some form of FM ops on top of that for customers to make sure through the development but also into production, how are we constantly evaluating new models? How are we thinking about how they're performing, controlling hallucinations and all those sorts of things? Any kind of views on that? Do you think? It's interesting, right? We were talking just before. We had DevOps, we had SecOps, we had ML Ops. Now we've got FM Ops, LLM Ops, and I've even heard AI Ops recently as well. So, any kind of viewpoints on kind of that wrap of continuous improvement around Gen AI workloads?
Yeah, I'm waiting for my first job rec that says, or CV that says, yeah, I do BizSec Dev FM Ops. It's still, I still find it quite surprising. It's still an emerging discipline, I think, in organizations. We were talking earlier about DevOps, and it's often treated as two separate organizations. Yeah, we do Dev and we do Ops. So what's your question? I think in this case, it's a great example, actually, with the boards. For too long, technology has been treated as one of these things which you build and then job done, move on. And that's why we've ended up with so much technology challenges out there, technology debt. I think with machine learning, we know we have things like model drift, for instance. You can't just put something into the wild and leave it. I think to me, it's one of the advantages of Amazon Bedrock. We don't know which is going to be the best model for your use case. As you said, we saw Claude 3 Opus come along and suddenly blow all of the benchmarks out of the water. But changing over to that model is actually pretty straightforward. But then everything you need to do around that, things like have you set up knowledge bases for RAG? How do I plug this into my workflow? How do you start to think about making this a lot more modular and treat it as a living system? Because I think what we need to nurture in organizations is this continual experimentation rather than this sort of one and done attitude that we often see.
I think that's what I love about AWS approach to generative AI is it's always been about the flywheel. The flywheel that was drawn on the napkin of maximizing the choice for customers. Yep. So I love the fact that we're able to offer this ensemble of different models, and test out which is the right one for the customer. One of the other challenges we see, obviously, as well, is the quality of the prompts. So prompt engineering is so important. I'd love to hear your feedback on the role that partners play, because it can be very easy if a customer is doing some of these projects on their own. If the quality of the prompts isn't good enough, then the output isn't great, and suddenly the perception of generative AI isn't as good. So I'd love to hear your feedback on the role that specialist partners would play in that to make a project successful.
Absolutely. You know, cost will be an issue as you scale, and prompt engineering, you actually have some of the tools already where you can manage your own costs rather than asking random questions. How do you craft proper prompts? To me, going back to some of the skill sets, I mean, one of the areas where partners have always been important to me in my previous life is, how do I accelerate my learning curve? How do I bring in trusted partners who aren't just going to get me going with an application with a proof of concept or such like, but are going to help me actually learn the skills I need to learn to then be self-sufficient? So it's really that jump start for organizations. You've done this many, many times with customers now. Just like my job at an executive level is to help them make their own mistakes from the learnings we've had from many, many others. I think you're doing the same. You're bringing those learnings from each engagement to accelerate your own customers.
So Dan, I know again you mentioned your stats earlier on. You love your stats. We've obviously done quite a lot of proof of concepts recently. Do you want to kind of go through what you're seeing in terms of conversion, reasons for not progression, etc., and then maybe it'd be good to get Phil's view on more of a broader picture. Yeah,
I'd love to hear Phil's feedback on this. So finished off the latest stats for us on the train this morning. So we've completed 23 proof of concepts, and 25% of those are going into the next phase, which will be what we consider to be a production use case because it's being used by the business. 25% are at a stage where they're not progressing right now, and that could be for a variety of reasons, maybe business buy-in, or they just want to put it on hold. 50% are progressing but self-managed, so they're not being managed by Firemind, and the customer has said to us, thanks very much, we're going to manage this ourselves and progress it now. So really good conversion rate so far. The biggest blockers for us, I spoke about it earlier, have been data, quality of data. We need to take a break and just improve the quality of our data, and in some cases Firemind are helping with that. Some cases integration, so we're trying to build applications that integrate with their application and they haven't got the people available to integrate. We do a lot of private equity work as well, so mergers, acquisitions will pause things also. And then the next biggest one after data is the ROI not being made clear enough. So we have our business sponsor, but they're unable to potentially explain to the business the impact and really scale it across a global business. So they've been the key findings for us. I think it's a pretty good conversion rate so far. I'd say that the delivery team have worked really hard on some of these because...
Very proud and impressed.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the perception from the customer is that Gen AI is going to solve everything and there's going to be an incredible outcome. So sometimes you're managing expectations, but I think we're pretty pleased so far with what we've achieved. But I'd love to hear your feedback on some of those stats, Phil, and how it compares to what you see as well.
Yeah, they're good stats. And it's interesting. About a year ago, probably over a year ago, we started to talk to customers about what is generative AI, where does it fit in with AI, machine learning, deep learning, fall in love with the problem, not the solution. We use lessons from history to sort of illustrate what should you be thinking about across people and ethics and technology and the such like. More recently, the conversation customers have wanted has been exactly this one. How do we start to scale? What do we really need to think about? How do we scale skills? And cost is absolutely a component of that. And it's complex, as you know. It's we know a large part of that is the model you choose. And then you choose the model and how good are your prompts? How many prompts are you putting in to actually get to the answer you want? Then there's a sort of underlying infrastructure. But the ROI is... at the end of the day, this strikes me as a little bit like, well, I've got a steam engine. Why would I ever upgrade to an electric engine? Or I've got a horse. Why would I move to the car? I think we are going to look back on this. And it's a little bit like the cloud inflection point, too. I've got a data center. Why would I move to the cloud? Well, we know it's more than just ROI. It's about the ability to experiment quickly. It's about customer expectations too. I've had some great conversations recently about use cases around generative AI, which have purely been about, as a customer, How do I get to the thing I want? The thing which is personalized for me, more customer intimacy than personalization. So there is a customer expectation out there that will be doing some of the stuff. If we look at some of the chatbot experiences out there, not naming any companies, but some of them, they send you just around in circles, and then you finally get to a human, they ask you exactly the same question. So this can't just be about money. Obviously that's a key element of it, but how do I actually reinvent my customer experience? Because some of the customer experiences out there are poor. But I do think there's a lot of education still to be done about how do you effectively manage your costs. We talk about, it's almost like the project management triangle of old. Do you want high quality? Do you want low cost? Or do you want all your requirements in there? Pick one, maybe two. If you've got a similar triangle with generative AI, performance, accuracy, and cost. And depending on your use case, you're going to make certain trade-offs. If I'm a legal company doing legal research, I want my accuracy to be really high. Performance doesn't matter if it doesn't return something instantly. And cost, I wouldn't say it's not an issue, but it's not a big issue. If I've got a customer-facing chatbot, maybe my trade-offs are a little bit different. So it's back to basics of architecture in business language, which is what trade-offs are you trying to make here?
Yeah, I think ROI can't just be about finances, right? It can't just be about what money am I going to save or whatever. It's got to be what are the people who are now not doing the mundane, repetitive tasks going to invent. What are they going to innovate, and then what are they going to think up next? And you can't quantify that until you give them the opportunity to go and do it, right?
Well, and it's important you think holistically like that too, because if I can improve productivity of my development team by, our internal stats was we saw an improvement of about 57% in our own dev teams. So I free up this time. What are those people now doing? Are they doing more coding? Perhaps they are, and that's brilliant if they're delivering value. If they're building stuff no one's using, who cares? So I think there's that second order effect, which is, okay, I'll drive efficiency in the organization, but am I then freeing up people, giving them the skills to actually add higher value to my company?
Yeah, exactly. Take control of that time you've saved and don't do something with it rather than just let it organically do its own thing.
And it's history repeating a little bit as well. You remember the days of cloud data center engineers were worried about what they were going to do next, and they were, very seamlessly in the end repurposed into higher level roles at the application layer. So it does feel like history repeating. From an AWS perspective as well, I think as a partner, AWS is really helping in the way that they're changing the funding mechanism. So what they did initially is said, okay, we're going to fund proof of concepts so people can experiment. And now the funding is changing in such a way that they are funding production use cases. So it's moving progressively to the next level. But I think those conversations that people like yourself are having, Phil, at the exec level, that's really important. I think that's something we as partners need to take on some of that messaging a little bit more. But the other thing we have in Firemind is we almost have a top-down, bottom-up approach. So we work across the business units and show the value to each of those business units. So you have a groundswell of value that you can show to that customer that gets them back up to the exec level to see the overall return as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Phil, I'd like to double click on that with you if we can. What's your view on that? The importance of education right throughout the business, but do we start at the exec level? And then it kind of has to cascade down, because all the people we speak to, line of business owners, and they're like, yeah, we can save time, this would be great, let's go use this technology. But is there a problem generically or generally that says that the execs need educating to make sure that this cascades down?
I think that the data shows us there is a problem. So if you're a board member or C-suite member, it doesn't matter what your function is, you're expected to manage people and you're expected to manage money. You don't just leave that to the CFO or the chief HR officer. There's a different tone, though, when it comes to technology and data. If you ask a C-suite, how many of you are comfortable with technology, you don't get many hands put up, and often you get the comment, that's why we have a CIO or a CDO or whatever it may be. Less than 25% of the C-suite typically have enough knowledge to do their job in terms of technology. So absolutely. Our hope is over the next few years, decade, whatever it is, when we ask the question, how many of you hate people and don't understand money? No one puts their hand up today. We want the same to be true when we say how many of you don't understand technology. So I think it's really, really important, because ultimately you want those leaders not just to say, I get generative AI and how I can use it, but also understand when they shouldn't be using technology or a different sort of technology, and understand that technology alone doesn't solve problems. It has to be integrated in the way people do business and such like. So in answer to your first question, though, yes, educate at the board level and the C-suite level, but also educate elsewhere. Build those pockets of knowledge up in the organization. Find those people who become the advocates for how to use generative AI or AI and ML.
Brilliant.
That was brilliant, Phil. Thank you very
you.
much. Let's wrap things up. Thank you, Phil Le-Brun, for being on the podcast. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, myself. You can check out this episode as ever and all the other episodes on our website. You can listen on Spotify, iTunes Podcast, or also on Podbean. On behalf of the Firemind podcast team, thank you, Phil.
Thanks, you for your time.
Appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you.